Certainly think they're on a trajectory to do it next year. One thing that influence in that administration, but when Starship comes in for a catch for a re-entry, it's going to be flying over populated areas. So it's going to be flying over much of Mexico, including almost directly over the city of Monterrey, Mexico, which is a very large metropolitan area with a couple million people in it, and then also over the Brownsville area on the U.S. side of the border. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any overflight concern with that. Of course, the space shuttle regularly re-entered over populated areas, and that was in a large part not ever a safety issue. Of course, the one exception was the breakup of the shuttle Columbia over Texas, which spread a lot of debris over a lightly populated area, but certainly areas where people live. And it's no one was injured in that, but there were cases where if someone had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, they could have been hit by some of that debris. So the safety analysis and the regulatory approval for that will be something to watch as well. Of course, that's something I think that the government needs to take seriously, but given the streamlined regulations and more light touch that we expect from the new administration, it may not be that significant of a delay.
Yeah, and our spaceflight now editor, Stephen Young, just reminded me a lot of the early shuttle missions did come in over with a landing in California. So obviously they may take a more cautious approach with these early landing catch attempts, whatever that may look like, whether it's not a full orbit around the Earth with a splashdown maybe in the Pacific Ocean, closer to what they were advertising with some of the initial launches of Starship, as opposed to the Indian Ocean splashdown that we've seen as of late. Currently T-minus 56 minutes, 40 seconds and counting. At this point, we are now less than 10 minutes away from the start of fueling beginning. For those just popping into our live stream here, you're watching joint live coverage of Starship Flight 6. Seeing some good venting there at the orbital launch tower as fueling is getting ready to begin, which will start with liquid methane on the ship upper stage at T-minus 49 minutes, 50 seconds. Joel, want to bring you into the conversation again as we're, seeing a pretty sizable venting here. We want to just talk about and explain to the viewers, the purpose of this vent and what it signifies at this stage in the countdown.
Yeah, so we see two big vents. We see one up at the middle of the tower, and then one coming right on the launch mount, right underneath the booster quick disconnect. So what's happening here is after they pulled go for propellant load operations, they began using liquid nitrogen to cool down all the pipes between the holding tanks and the vehicles. Those need to be cooled down to to minimize boil off during actual propellant loading. And so they have vents shortly before the actual connections to the vehicles, and they run liquid nitrogen into the lines, and that starts boiling off as it cools down the pipes and vents out. So once we move into actual propellant loading on the vehicles, we should see both of these vents stop, and then they will start up again at the end of propellant load as SpaceX vents off and clears the lines ahead of launch.
Yeah, for those familiar with Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy launches, we see a similar but singular big vent that comes up about the T-minus 20 minute, 20 second mark for Falcon 9 launches, both here and at Vandenberg in California. So similar concepts, obviously different style with the launch tower there at Starbase. Seeing a little bit of the ground infrastructure here. Zach, if you want to jump in here, you talk a little bit about some of the changes of the orbital tank farm. Obviously exceedingly different from the first couple of Starship launches. Everything is, or just about everything is moved to a horizontal model. If you want to talk about the reason why that is and some of the benefits that have been offered to SpaceX from this change.
Yeah, definitely. So as most of you all will remember, the vertical tank farm was primarily mostly in use for the first 2 launches, and they definitely sustained a lot of damage during those launches, especially after the first one. You know, they have a berm that was in place to kind of direct the exhaust plume over the tank farm, but I don't think it really did its job very well and still allowed the plume to basically go straight through the tank farm. So they weren't very well protected structures. They were kind of nice just because they were such large tanks and allowed you to store such a massive amount in a single container. But overall, I think they realized that they were just having too many issues with it, and it made a lot more sense for them to switch over to a, manufactured tanks that were basically designed for this instead of going with, a homemade storage system. So now all of their tanks are horizontal hot dog tanks. They've added, they're adding additional tanks as well too. We're still waiting on, I think, 2 large tanks to show up probably after this launch at some point. They do have the foundations prepared for it. And in general, most of what they're doing right now also has to do with preparing for that second launch site, like I said. So needing to be able to perform the same operations on both pads. The biggest of those, I think, is detanking. So we don't know if they're going to use the same pumps for loading propellant all the way across over to that other pad. But the other challenge, like I said, is with detanking the booster and the ship. You need different equipment set up in order to do that between the 2 pads. So I think they're actually going to duplicate that system, whereas other systems will actually be shared. So I think that's one of the things they're currently working on right now. Beyond that, their pressure building system for the actual propellant tanks has been changed a little bit. It's a little bit difficult to describe without being able to show some of the components involved in that. But yeah, it's mostly centered around some water tanks that they have in the middle of the tank farm. But yeah, I mean, I think their efficiency has gone up quite a bit. They've been able to speed up the propellant loading process by adding in additional pumps, which was after flight 3, I believe. So yeah, they've been able to get that prop loading time down even further since then. So yeah, tons of improvements in efficiency since the early flights.
Absolutely. And as we are now T-minus 50 minutes, 36 seconds and counting, we're less than a minute from the beginning of that fueling getting underway. So we'll look for the tapering of the vent that we've been talking about here at the orbital launch tower, nicknamed Mechazilla, of course. Stephen, I'll pose this question to you coming in from the Rocket Girl through the Spaceflight Now side of the stream, asking, question, since the trajectory is east, will I be able to see the launch from Houston? And since you've got some experience seeing activity from a little bit north of Starbase, I'll throw that to you and also tease out that up on the International Space Station, one of NASA's best astronaut photographers, Don Pettit, will apparently attempt to capture the launch of Starship if the visibility is good enough from the space station. So his son has posted a message about that. But Stephen, if you want to take the trajectory and the visibility question here.
Yeah, thanks for forwarding that to me. I think seeing it from Houston for this launch is probably unlikely, although I wouldn't discount it or eliminate any chance of seeing it entirely, because as we know, people see these launches from hundreds of miles away, especially as they climb higher and get over the horizon. So but given the time of day, 4 p.m. Central Time, it's daylight. Of course, the weather here in Texas is quite good, so the visibility should be no problem. But I think you'd have a much higher chance of seeing this launch if it was closer to twilight, at dawn or shortly after sunset, as you get that jellyfish effect as the rocket climbs higher in the sky. That would be, easily visible from Houston. But I think given the time of day, it's probably going to be difficult. If you are able to see anything, it may just be a dot, on the horizon with, maybe a faint plume. But if you have clear skies and you have the time and a clear visibility off to the south or southwest, it's worth a try, certainly, as it will climb above the horizon from Houston, because there is a ground station, a tracking site in Houston that SpaceX uses to actually receive signals and telemetry from Starship. So it will be above the horizon. It's just a question of will the atmospheric dynamics and environment allow you to see it.
Yeah.
And sorry to interrupt here. It
No,
seems
please.
like we may potentially have propellant loading beginning on the ship.
Yes, based off the timeline, certainly we're at that point. Both methane and LOX should be loading on board the ship upper stage now at this point. So, Zach, since you happen to jump in, what are we looking for here? What should folks be watching as tanking now gets underway?
Well, one of the big signifiers, I guess, is the venting coming from the middle of the tank farm. They're kind of vents that are shooting up in a bit of a V pattern. So that was kind of the first indication right there, but also seeing those lines going into the ship QD are a bit frosty right now as well too. So yeah, we should start seeing the frost line build up on the ship here soon. I don't think they've started on the booster yet. The launch mount is still venting currently, so as soon as that stops, probably assume that they've started on the booster.
Yeah, we'll certainly keep a visual eye out for that. For folks that are watching the clock, that should start at about T-minus 41 minutes and 15 seconds for booster liquid methane loading, and then the LOX starts flowing T-minus 35 minutes, 39 seconds. So at this point in time, things are continuing on track for a good planned launch at the beginning of the window here of Starship Flight 6. Of course, if past is protocol, they do have an option once they get down to the T-minus 40-second mark to hold for Joel or Zach, can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe they have the ability to hold for 25 minutes if they hit the T-minus 40-second mark, and then need to hold off on launching if they need to clear out a boat in the keep out zone or something like that.
I wanted to say 20, but you might be right. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly, but yeah, they can hold for a period at that T-minus 40-second mark, which is a nice safety check to have. But one of the really remarkable things I think that we've seen out of these last flights is how well these countdowns seem to go for an experimental rocket. SpaceX, you can really see their experience, I think, with these test flights, that what they've learned from the hundreds of Falcon 9s that they've launched, and they've really got their systems down. They know what to look for in these countdowns, and have really been putting on a show with how well they do it.
And Joel, I'll stick with you since you've got another question coming in here from Rick Donner, who asks, do we know how many engines will be involved in the relight demo? I believe the answer to that is 1, but if you can confirm that and explain why they would only relight 1 as opposed to the 3 vacuum engines.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And you want to relight a sea level when you're doing anything just because they're the ones that gimbal, so they give you control. But really, this, the purpose of this isn't any real course changes or any real delta V changes. The purpose is just to prove that they can relight these in vacuum. It's something that hasn't been done yet, and it's a big thing on their checklist, I think, because I think this is a big reason. They've had issues with the Starlink dispenser and stuff, and but I think really to get operational and go to orbit rather than these suborbital flights we're seeing, they need to prove that they can relight in space to prove that once they get to orbit on a future flight, they will be able to safely get back out of that orbit, because as we know, Starship is got a heat shield on one side, and it is incredibly large, and if it were to go up into orbit and not be able to deorbit, then it, at some point in the future, it poses a pretty significant threat, given its size and its thermal protection. It is not the kind of thing that you want to have an uncontrolled reentry on.
And Stephen, bringing you back in the conversation here, obviously NASA is also very, very eager to see the relight of an engine on the ship upper stage, since obviously as the human landing system for both Artemis missions 3 and 4, having it be able to propulsively land on the moon and then lift off the moon's surface, and for Artemis 3 dock with the Orion spacecraft and then subsequently the Gateway space station, proving the relight capability at this stage in flight is going to be key to the beginning of those building blocks, right?
That's right, Will, and it's also a prerequisite to going into orbit, as has been said before. So that means they need to demonstrate the relight capability before they can actually accomplish the in-space refueling demonstration. So that's one of the requirements to get into that phase of demonstrations next year, is to get the Starship into low Earth orbit, and before you can do that, you need to demonstrate the relight capability.
Now currently T-minus 41 minutes, 17 seconds and counting. At this point, the booster fuel loading should be just now getting underway. Based off of the venting we're seeing here, Zach, is that lining up with what we're seeing visually from this camera view?
It doesn't appear that it's started yet. We still have the launch mount venting right now, so I don't believe that it's started yet. They may potentially start methane before. However, it's difficult to tell until you see the frost line with that. But as of right now, still no prop loading on the booster.
Well, actually, as you were talking, I should have jumped in as about 40 seconds into your comments there. SpaceX did tweet that prop load of the booster is actually just now underway. So we are getting in business there with the super heavy booster with the liquid methane, and LOX should follow shortly thereafter, about T-minus 35 minutes and 39 seconds. Taking a look back at our question block here. And again, for folks that may just be joining in here with our special live coverage between Lab Padre and Spaceflight Now, welcome in. I'm Will Robinson Smith, reporter with Spaceflight Now. We're glad to have you with us. At this point in time, fueling on the super heavy booster has just begun. We are awaiting liquid oxygen load on the booster B13, but fueling on ship upper stage with both liquid methane and liquid oxygen has been going for several minutes now at this point. taking a look at our question portal, and for those who want to ask a question, you can just click type the @ symbol, the word question, hit the space bar, and then type out your question. This one coming from Jason asking, how does the payload capacity of Starship compare to that of the space shuttle? And Steven, since you've done quite extensive reporting over many years about the space shuttle program, I want to toss that over to you, how the two stack up, since, you know, obviously there are some key differences on capacity.
Right. Well, so the space shuttle had a capacity for payload mass to low Earth orbit of about 50,000 pounds or so. So that's, 22, 23 metric tons, if I'm doing my math right in my head here. So Starship, especially when they get to Block 3, when they're able to get that full capability, full capacity of 150, even 200 metric tons to low Earth orbit. So that will be, roughly, just shy of 10 times the capability of the space shuttle. So a significant increase in payload capacity compared to the shuttle, and that's what Starship will offer. Of course, version 1 that we're currently seeing, I think Elon said earlier in the year that it's the current version of Starship we're seeing is only quote unquote capable of about 40 to 50 metric tons to low Earth orbit, but that will be improved with Block 2, and then with Block 3, I think is when SpaceX hopes to see the full advertised capability of Starship available.
And certainly there are, I'm sure, a lot of both investors into the Starship program and SpaceX writ large, as well as customers, whether they be commercial or research institutions that are eager to see that increased capacity once Starship is able to get to that version 3, especially start really maximizing its capabilities. Taking a close-up look here at the ship upper stage, starting to see that frost line begin to build as both the LOX and the liquid methane start to stack up and fuel this rocket, as we're now T-minus 36 minutes, 47 seconds and counting. We are just a little less than about a minute away actually now from the start of booster LOX load.
It looks like it may have actually started just a few moments ago. The venting on the launch mount has finally stopped.
All good observations, gentlemen. Appreciate that. Joel, just as we're seeing this view of Starship stack and against a beautiful Texas sky here, I want to talk about the visibility, not so much on this end of the mission, but on the back end once ship splashes down in the Indian Ocean. And if you want to expound upon the importance of SpaceX pivoting to an afternoon launch from here to get a daylight splashdown of the ship upper stage, why that's so important at this stage of the program's development for them to not only get the data from Starship, but get as good of visual records as they can.
Yeah, one thing that we heard SpaceX talk about during Flight 5 was that they were really hoping with their accurate landing that they were going to be able to get some footage of that heat shield before the ship fell over into the ocean. And they didn't really, I think, get the shots that they wanted, but having it in daylight, and provided that the accuracy is the same, having those buoys there with cameras able to track the ship for much longer rather than just seeing it during the landing burn, they should be able to get much better footage of the condition that the heat shield is in as it's coming down. And really kind of this launch window, I think, should kind of give them the best of both worlds, because they're coming down shortly after sunrise, I believe, in the Indian Ocean, which means that initial the initial atmospheric reentry and heating should still be pretty dark, which is kind of ideal for seeing that plasma build up around the heat shield. But then as they get lower, they'll move into daylight, and really the cameras will be a lot more functional for them.
Absolutely, and just want to go ahead at this point to bring in for a moment some really nice drone images that we were seeing from SpaceX, and we'll check in periodically with the SpaceX feed as countdown progresses. Now T-minus 33 minutes, 39 seconds and counting. At this point in the countdown, all 4 tanks on both stages of the Starship rocket are now fueling. As we take a close look here at the base of the super heavy booster, you can see the liquid oxygen now flowing on board B13. We got back to that drone video here from SpaceX. Some really excellent shots of Starbase here. A nice vantage point of the second tower, which of course will play a big role in SpaceX's plans to have an on-orbit fueling depot that'll enable missions not only to the moon, but eventually onto Mars as well. Just want to point out very quickly, for a little bit of housekeeping, you'll notice our countdown clock at the top of the screen, a little bit different than what you're seeing on the SpaceX feed. The clock in the biggest part of the screen at the top there, that is in real time, and what you're seeing from the SpaceX feed coming in on a slight delay. So as the mission progresses, we'll be making our initial callouts based off of real time, as those will line up with our cameras there on the ground at Starbase, and then we'll pivot to the SpaceX feed and their clock once we get a little further in the mission. Let's go ahead and listen into SpaceX's Dan Hewitt for just a second here as he's giving an update.
About T-minus 49 minutes, and then the booster followed just a couple minutes after at about T-minus 41. We're almost halfway full on ship, just about a third on booster. Those are both going to continue until we're about 3 minutes 20 seconds before liftoff on ship, and then the booster is going to close out at about 2 minutes and 50 seconds. So we pretty much we're loading up right to that last possible minute, keeping it as dense and cold as possible, and then getting off the launch pad. The countdown startup sequence, everything will look very familiar if you watched Flight 5, assuming you did. But you're going to see the engines start to ignite at about 3 seconds before liftoff. They're going to start up in 3 different groups. First, those center 13, then 15 of that outer ring, and then those final 5, bringing all 33 Raptors online. After that, we'll see about a second later, and then it'll lift off. So a couple seconds from first light until motion. As usual, we can hold at T-minus 40 seconds if we have any last-minute issues to clear, anything with the range, anything that triggers on the vehicle. And if we pass T-minus 10 seconds, the deflector fires, and then we scrub, then we're done for the day for at least 24 hours. But weather is fantastic, light breeze, no clouds in the sky. Not tracking any hardware constraints to launch today. If we're not able to get off the pad, though, we've got opportunities throughout the week, could be 24 to 48 hours later. But everything looking great. I'm excited to be able to see another one of these get off the pad. Check back in with everybody in just a couple of minutes. Back over to Jesse and Kate.
And a good update there from Dan. As of course, we are busily watching this upcoming launch preparation for the Starship vehicle. Of course, the space beat never seems to give us a rest, does it, Stephen? Want to go ahead and bring you back in here. stand by 1 second. Sorry, just listening to some background conversations here, just making sure I'm not missing anything. Steve, I want to go ahead and bring you in here as we're getting ready to see this Starship launch. We do have some moon-related news as it pertains to potentially SpaceX and or Blue Origin. If you want to go ahead and talk about the new plans that NASA just rolled out.
Sure thing, Will. Yeah, NASA just put out a release less than an hour ago now, talking about their plans to award some new contracts to SpaceX and Blue Origin to deliver large cargo elements to the lunar surface with their human-rated lunar landers. So we knew this was in the works. I think last year NASA put out a notice that they, plan to award cargo contracts to these two companies, but we've seen those plans come into a little more granular detail with today's announcement. So we expect, NASA expects to award a contract to SpaceX to deliver the Japanese-built pressurized rover to the lunar surface no earlier than fiscal year 2032 in support of the Artemis 7 mission and then subsequent Artemis missions. And then NASA expects to award Blue Origin and their Blue Moon human-rated lander to do an uncrewed mission to deliver a lunar surface habitat to the moon no earlier than fiscal year 2033. So just at the start of our broadcast, you mentioned we talked about the possibility of SpaceX getting a larger role in Artemis. Of course, this announcement today is one example of that, and I expect to see more of these, especially as the Trump administration takes a look at the space policy and the architecture and plans for the Artemis program. But of course, this announcement today, predates the election. This was already in the works beginning last year.
Yeah, and just for our viewers, note the images that we popped up on the left-hand side of the screen, the main part of the picture here. You're seeing the cargo variants of both what Stephen was just talking about, the Starship lander that'll be used in the HLS cargo version, and then of course Blue Origin's Blue Moon cargo variant of its lander. And the vehicle that you see coming out of the two, I believe, is the aforementioned pressurized rover that JAXA is creating through Toyota as the main, the prime contractor there. Of course, obviously well known for their terrestrial vehicles, now working on a pressurized rover for the moon.
Right. Well, thanks for putting these up. I think that's a good illustration of the size differences between Starship and the Blue Moon lander. Of course, Blue Moon is a large vehicle in and of itself, but it is significantly smaller than Starship. I think the Blue Moon lander, just looking it up, the height of the Blue Moon lander is about 16 meters or 52 feet tall. And so that's about, about a quarter of the height of Starship. But still significantly larger than the Apollo lunar module that landed the astronauts on the moon in the Apollo program. So one thing I think it's worth noting is the pressurized rover obviously comes from Japan. And as the Trump administration, we expect it to take another look at the architecture and plans for the Artemis program. But one thing it might be difficult to unwind and may not be popular to unwind is some of the international agreements that the Artemis program has found over the past few years, like the Artemis Accords, for example, is one thing. And then also these contributions from Japan, from the European Space Agency, from Canada, and from even new emerging spacefaring nations like the United Arab Emirates and India. All these, the way the Artemis program is set up, it includes these contributions from international partners. And of course, that's a kind of a counterweight to China's plans to land on the moon in partnership with Russia. So as the Trump administration looks at the Artemis program, I think there will be a lot of interest in trying to keep those international partnerships part of it.
Absolutely. Obviously, the international nature of Artemis is something that is really important for NASA to continue to cultivate. And in just a second here, I'm going to play a little bit of tape from an interview that we did prior to this launch with NASA astronaut Randy Bresnik, who is the assistant to the chief of the astronaut office, in which we talked about some of the developments for the astronaut office and the role that they're playing in the Artemis architecture, giving their advice and recommendations to some of the commercial partners like Axiom Space and like SpaceX in the development of their hardware in ways that will best be able to integrate with the humans that'll be living and working on it. Go ahead and bring that in whenever it's ready. For now, we're T-minus 23 minutes, 14 seconds and counting with this timeline here. Appreciate all of you who are joining with us live, whether on the Spaceflight Now or the Lab Padre live streams. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor and just hit the like button. It's a free and quick way to support what we do here at Spaceflight Now and Lab Padre and help bring this joint live stream coverage to more eyeballs. We're coming up on the next milestone here in the fueling process, which is the Raptor chill on the booster and ship. Before we go ahead and get to that point, let's go ahead and listen into part of our conversation with Mr. Randy Bresnik, during which we talk about what it's like on the inside of the HLS version of Starship.
You know, the biggest thing to note with Starship, you know, having been in other spacecraft, is how big it is. You know, that is just such a unusual thing for us for a dynamic spacecraft. You know, space station is, you know, the size of, they say, like a 5-bedroom house on the interior volume, and but to have, you know, go from an Orion or a Soyuz like I flew, or a shuttle, and just go into the expanse of the flight deck of Starship is just amazing. Where you've got a you know, part of it where it's a, you know, the flight deck where the seats are, where the controls and displays are, and then you've got on the same floor, you've got the habitation areas, the hygiene areas, and then you go down into another deck below to where you then have access to the airlocks, which then go to what they call the garage, with the garage being the part that's exposed to vacuum, where you end up would exit the airlocks in your spacesuits to be able to hop on the elevator to then go down to the lunar surface. And so, you know, obviously very new concepts to where you have such a large lander that is as tall as it is, and that we've got to take an elevator down to the surface to get past all the levels of the tanks and the engines and everything that are below the crew compartment. You know, VR has been helpful in these past several years as they, you know, before they've gotten full-size mock-ups available. It's pretty neat to, you know, do VR when you're looking at the design of the airlock and where to put the hatch, what size is the hatch, and you get into the garage area where the elevator is. And I remember being struck a couple of years ago where in the VR, you know, you come out of that airlock and you're kind of in a enclosed area, and then that garage door is open where the elevator goes out, and you would actually go surfing. You can go out there in the VR, and then from, you know, 30-ish meters up above the lunar surface, look down at the expanse of the lunar surface, you know, with the graphics they have, and you get a glimpse of what it will be like for those first humans to see the surface, not just from, you know, the surface itself, but to see, have this visual expanse before they go down to the surface to go explore. It's going to be amazing.
And our thanks again to Randy Bresnik with the Astronaut Office, and for the folks at the Johnson Space Center for connecting us and talking a little bit more about that. Now T-minus 19 minutes, 50 seconds. At this point, the engine chill on both booster and ship should be just about coming up right now. Zach, bringing you back in here. Obviously, the chill down of the engine's a very important part of thermally conditioning the rocket in both stages prior to this mission getting underway. But you want to expound upon that and maybe some of the lessons learned from previous flights as far as the engines are concerned with this whole venture.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been probably, at least the way that they're doing it right now, kind of standard through the first 6 flights. You can see the engine chill venting going on the ship currently. It's actually coming out just below the grid fins on the booster. So there's actually like a little pipe that connects from the vent on the ship and also passes through the hot stage ring, or not through the hot stage ring, but outside of the hot stage ring and then below those grid fins. The booster does the same thing. It actually collects directly from the side of the engines, or sorry, actually on a panel around the rim of the engine skirt. So all of that gets dumped into a pond, which it doesn't appear has started yet. Usually you can see it to the, or just below the tower from that view that we were just looking at. Yeah, I mean, thermal conditioning is definitely important. They also do it on the methane side, which is something that we saw during the actual landing attempt last time. So as long as they're planning to restart an engine, as long as it's not running, they have to basically cycle methane and liquid oxygen through those engines in order to keep them conditioned. And so that's something that you'll see when the booster comes in from landing, is basically that the methane vent from the front of the booster QD, and as it's falling into its own exhaust plume, that'll be ignited by those flames. So I think a lot of people weren't expecting to see that during landing and kind of thought it was maybe some sort of issue, but it's fully expected and just part of that process for the center engines that aren't running.
And speaking of things that maybe folks aren't expecting, Joel, you know, for those who were not present for Flight 5 and maybe this is their first time seeing Starship in person, or if they just happen to be in the Rio Grande Valley area and not really paying attention to this at all, they may experience quite a bit of noise in just a little bit when the Super Heavy booster comes back in for the planned catch with a sonic boom. Can you kind of give a little bit of an overview of what the sonic boom is and, you know, the impact of that? Is, you know, from Flight 5, you saw some local news reports that it could be heard from about 90 miles away.
Yeah, as the booster comes back in and it crosses over the sonic speed of sound, you know, as we've seen through the history of spaceflight, that creates a sonic boom, a pressure wave there that goes out ahead of it. And given the, you know, that the sound of that is related to the size of the vehicle, and given how big these boosters are, it creates a very loud sonic boom. Not enough to do any damage. You know, a lot of people were worried, and I think a lot of the spectators last time were surprised by just how loud it was. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's actually two sonic booms in quick succession, because you get one as the engine section passes through the sound barrier, and then immediately followed by another one when the slightly wider grid fins pass through that. And so you'll get a kind of a double clap.
Yeah, certainly for those who've watched Falcon 9 rockets here in Florida or out in California with a return to landing site, or RTLS landing as opposed to a drone ship landing, we've all more or less gotten used to it when it happens, but still quite a new sensation for those in southern Texas or close to the border there in Mexico as well. Now, T-minus 14 minutes, 54 seconds and counting. So far, things progressing well with the fueling process. Want to throw this question to you, Zach. This coming in from Kevin Morgan, asking, what is the long-term goal at Starbase compared to the Cape, not only for Starship, but all rockets? Obviously, we've got one launch tower that is in operation here, getting ready to support Flight 6 of Starship, and Tower 2 coming online in the fairly near future. But we want to expand that out to what is the broad long-term goals for Starbase as we know them.
Well, Starbase was initially expected to just be the R&D facility, and to some degree that is still the case, but with the delays that they've had with getting Starship up and going at the Cape, this is still going to remain their main launch site. So I believe they're expecting to reach a launch cadence of once every other week, and that will be the milestone that they need to reach before they actually move operations over to KSC. So eventually they'll have both of those locations operational, and probably launch pads in other locations as well too. The more the better, is in order to achieve that launch cadence that they're expecting for not only refueling missions, but also in the future when they're sending vehicles to Mars. So Starbase should still remain their main launch facility. So yeah, we're gonna have some interesting times coming up here in the future once they get that second pad operational. But when the second pad is operational, we'll probably see them stop operations on the first pad for basically refurbishment, which may include completely demolishing the launch mount, more than likely. They'll probably end up removing the chopsticks and installing a shorter pair, like we'll see on Pad B. So yeah, they got a ton of work ahead of them. Every time they finish something, they start something else. So it's a never-ending process here at Starbase. And one more thing I did want to just mention here, because I'm not sure if we mentioned it in the stream, but it appears that SpaceX has mentioned that the ship will be entering nose down. So that is going to be pretty aggressive. Interesting to see how that turns out.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that, Zach. That'll be hopefully something that we'll be able to get good visuals on as it enters in over the Indian Ocean. We'll see how far out the tracking capabilities of the water or marine assets are that SpaceX has positioned out there, but fingers crossed that the good lighting will provide some good visuals, obviously supported with Starlink, as is the rest of the flight with the ship upper stage. So if things continue as we saw with Flight 5, it should be pretty seamless and fairly uninterrupted, as SpaceX has more than 6,500 Starlinks on orbit now at this point that are currently in operation. Stephen, I'll pose this question to you, since we were talking about some of the further down the road capabilities of Starship. It's coming from AA5MC with a super chat to Lab Padre stream, asking question: will Starship ever be able to achieve a higher orbit without refueling or the assistance of a tug?
That's a really good question. I don't think so, at least under the architecture that SpaceX has publicly commented about so far. To go beyond low Earth orbit will require in-space refueling. So to go to geostationary transfer orbit, to go to the moon, to go to a Lagrange point or Mars, I think all of those require refueling.
Sorry to cut you off here. We're just getting some new renders here being shared by SpaceX in real time of both Starship docking with the Orion capsule you saw here, and now a good rendering of the new Axiom suits as astronauts are coming out of the garage, and a couple of starships here. Some new graphics that we had not yet seen before, but getting better eyes on what the future of lunar exploration could look like.
Yeah, that's really cool to see. Multiple starships on the moon. Orion docked with Starship in lunar orbit. That Orion docked with Starship image is what we should see on Artemis 3.
Sorry to have cut you off. If you want to continue and finish your point on the higher orbits and the tug question.
No, well, I think I finished it. Just basically to sum it up, I think with the architecture SpaceX has publicly discussed, to go beyond low Earth orbit will require some propellant transfer or refueling in LEO.
And of course, that it's slightly different, but a similar type of technology is also going to be needed to execute on Blue Origin's human landing system and their cargo lander for the Blue Moon spacecraft once it is ready to start making trips to the moon as well. Currently T-minus 9 minutes, 7 seconds and counting on the countdown. Things will continue to move along pretty continuously from here. The next milestone that we're looking for is the conclusion of ship prop load. That's set to wrap up at about T-minus 3 minutes and 20 seconds. And at T-minus 2 minutes and 50 seconds is when booster prop load should wrap up. Joel, throw to you, with those milestones pretty close to on the horizon, what are we going to be seeing visually once we hit those points?
Yeah, as prop load completes here, we will start to see venting from the ground infrastructure again, from the bottom of the booster quick disconnect and from the tower, as SpaceX works to empty the propellant out of those lines ahead of launch. Yeah, should be significant venting again as we cross that, and get ready for showtime here.
Do you want to go to this video here? SpaceX showing cryo test for Starship Flight 7, which features the first Block 2 version of the ship upper stage. Zach, if you want to jump in with these visuals of some of the key differences here on the ship.
Yeah, so one of the big differences, you can see there's a lot more propellant on version 2 of the ship, so that frost line is going up a lot higher than what we've seen in the past. Also, the position of the Pez dispenser loader has changed as well too, so that is, I believe, a little bit higher up as well, and that makes the actual payload section a little bit smaller as well too. The Ring Watchers have a really great article that explains all of this stuff. Been working pretty hard on updating renders for the version 2 of the ship, but yeah, tons of great changes on that, and it's going to be really exciting to see that for the first time on Flight 7.
And the different angles of the forward flaps, obviously going to be a big difference as well. We saw those briefly. If you want to, can you just expound on the reasoning for that element of the change and the better protection that could provide for those flaps during peak heating as reentry gets underway?
Yeah, definitely. So those flaps are a little bit more out of the way, so that with their positioning should allow them to hopefully survive better during reentry. I think that's some of the issues that they've been having right now are ones that they're not able to necessarily do anything about. So that is one thing that will make this flight a little bit more interesting, given that we know that they're probably still going to have issues with the forward flaps. What's going to happen when they attempt to do a more aggressive reentry. I think this is, again, probably gathering data for giving them something to compare with once they start with version 2 of the ship. So yeah, that is going to be one of the more exciting features as well. If they end up getting similar results, that's going to be very difficult to address, because they're going to have to make some major changes if that doesn't solve the issue that they've been having.
Just listening here to some of the notes from the SpaceX commentators about the potential for holds or scrubs and how that'll work, just to reiterate for the audience, if they reach the T-minus 40-second point, they can hold for about 20 minutes. Once the flame deflector is activated about T-minus 10 seconds, though, if for some reason there's an issue that causes them to stop the countdown process, that would be an automatic scrub. Commentators saying that things are still looking go for launch at this point in time. Of course, we'll continue to monitor that as we proceed. Now, less than 4 minutes to go before the planned liftoff. You may have seen in the SpaceX graphic at the upper right-hand corner of the screen that the weather, the range, and the health of the vehicle all showing green in support of a liftoff here in the next few minutes. Want to listen to SpaceX's Dan Hewitt for just a quick update here.
So we should be done with our prop load on ship momentarily. Then about 30 seconds later, we'll close out on booster. Our flight control team on board, or in the building just behind me, not on board. Some of them might wish they were on board. Flight control team in the building behind me, they're going to have a lot of work to do right after we lift off, as we still have a lot of manual checks that happen on the tower prior to the flight director, who's going to be Tristan Pierce again today, giving a manual command to bring the booster back to the launch site. And the tower did just incredibly well on the last flight. We didn't lose any of our required redundancy for a catch, so we're hoping to see that again today. A lot of the team, really putting armor on the tower, making all of those things work, played a huge role in making that catch possible, and looking forward to hopefully seeing that happen again. And of course, sending our first payload to space. You can see the banana. It's very tightly secured, but I assure you it does have some room to float around. So once we're in a zero gravity environment, we should see our first Starship zero gravity indicator putting on a little bit of a show. And that's looking right in. That's where we're going to have Starlinks. That's our PEZ deployer. So getting its ride to space. So coming up on about 2.5 minutes, we are closing out on all of our prop load. Just heard that our fill drains are starting to close, so that means we're no longer going to be flowing propellant into the booster and the ship. We're going to do what's called pushbacks. So all of that propellant in the ground systems is going to get pushed back to the tanks, clear out everything around the pad right before we light those 33 engines and take off. Just quick reminder, you're going to see fire start at the bottom. You're going to see the deflector start at about 10 seconds before launch. Lots of water to help dissipate all that heat, all that sound. And then the engine starting up in 3 different groups. And then about a second after T0, we should see liftoff. About 2.5 minutes into the flight, a little bit longer, we'll see hot staging. And that's when we're going to be listening really close on those loops to see if we're going to be bringing the booster back for a catch today. Do always want to caution, it's never a guarantee. We've done this once. We'll see if we do it again. We're only going to do it if the booster and the tower are looking really good before we attempt to bring it back here. But coming up on a minute, not tracking any holds on the board right now. So as long as we don't have any last second things, which do happen. All right, flight director just confirmed T-minus 1 minute.
And again, SpaceX is coming in on a slight delay, which is why you heard that 1 minute. Currently T-minus 30 seconds in real time. $20 seconds, not holding at the T-minus 40 minute mark per the SpaceX feed. 15 seconds. We're go for launch in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. Flame deflector activated. 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and movement. We have liftoff of Starship Flight 6. And the rocket has cleared the tower. And a great ascent of the rocket so far, now coming up on a minute into flight. Starship approaching max Q, the point of peak aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Some great tracking shots by the teams at Lab Padre and Spaceflight now. Call for max Q. We're coming upon a few different events in fairly rapid succession. We'll see for the Super Heavy booster MECO, which in this case is most engines cut off, then the hot staging, the stage separation, then the Super Heavy boost back burn will start at about T plus 2 minutes and 44 seconds. Good flights so far, all 33 Raptors on the booster. Continuing a good burn so far. Less than 30 seconds to MECO. SpaceX monitoring to see if they are going to go forward with the catch today. Approaching MECO. And you see MECO there. Hot staging. SpaceX confirms that the tower is go for catch. Ignition on the ship upper stage. Some good on camera or on ship views. Or this is the Super Heavy booster, one of those hypersonic grid fins there. Now nearly 4 minutes into flight. Boost back burn shutdown has occurred. Booster has been sounds like there may be an offshore diversion, which means we are, sounds like not going to see SpaceX go for the Super Heavy booster catch. So the Super Heavy booster will be landing in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. They are not going to be attempting a tower catch today. SpaceX said in the run-up to this mission, this was always a possibility that if all of the commit criteria were not in alignment on both the Super Heavy booster as well as the tower, that they would not go for a catch, and that is what we have here today. Continuing to track the Super Heavy booster as it makes its descent. That little white dot at the base of the box on the right-hand side of your screen, that is the hot stage ring that was jettisoned. Now T plus 5 minutes, 41 seconds into the count. The landing burn should be starting in less than a minute on the Super Heavy booster. SpaceX will, of course, continue to get good flight data from the Super Heavy booster, even though it is not in a position for them to make a catch attempt today. This tracking view from the perspective of South Padre Island, and this from due west of the launch pad. So we're coming up on the landing burn start. Now landing burn underway. And a splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico of the Super Heavy booster B-13. And the booster has exploded on the water. So for those joining once again, SpaceX waved off a catch attempt of the Super Heavy booster, instead opting to have a water splashdown instead. So you can see the ship upper stage still continuing on with its flight, though, now T plus 7 minutes 41 seconds in real time, 7:29 on the SpaceX feed. The next milestone that we're tracking here is actually an important test that's coming up in just about 30 minutes. Will be the ignition of a Raptor engine. Getting a nice view from multiple perspectives on the ship here. Want to bring in our commentating panel here as we're continuing to watch the ship upper stage. Stephen, I'll start with you. We always knew that waving off of the Super Heavy booster catch was certainly a possibility, but your thoughts on the decision to not go for the catch at this juncture on Flight 6?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what SpaceX, the flight control team, saw in the data that made them decide not to attempt the catch. Everything looked pretty normal to me with the Super Heavy booster on descent. Certainly looked like it reached the ocean intact and at a relatively low rate of speed, low descent rate. So unless it was significantly off course or is a problem with with guidance or something, who knows? We'll see. I'm sure we'll find out from Elon or from SpaceX, even perhaps during their broadcast, what caused that issue, and to see them not go for the catch. A little disappointing. Again, not entirely surprising. This is only the second time they've tried it, but it looks like maybe they learned something from the descent that they can adjust or tweak on the next vehicle to make chances of a catch even greater.
Well, and as we heard from some audio that Elon Musk likely inadvertently published to X, formerly Twitter, with a debrief from Flight 5, it sounded like they got pretty close to having to.